The House impeachment vote. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning, and welcome to our special coverage of the impeachment of President Trump. That is the scene on the House floor this morning,
Speaker of the House of Representatives,
where they have just gone into session to begin these historic proceedings. It will begin with a prayer this morning, and of course, this is only the third time in history where the House has met to impeach an American president.
Merciful God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We pause in your presence and ask guidance for the men and women of the People's House. As the members take this time to consider far-reaching legislation and consider historic constitutional action, give them wisdom and discernment. Help them to realize that your constituency is wider and broader than ever we could measure or determine. Help them, and help us all, to put away any judgments that belong to you and do what we can to live together in harmony. Bless us this day and every day, and may all that is done be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The House begins, as it always does, with a prayer.
Section 7A of House Resolution 758, the Journal of the Last Day's Proceedings.
And now they will be doing some normal business before they begin the debate on the rule for this impeachment proceeding. Now the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Leave a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary,
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
pursuant to Clause 4 of Rule 1, the following enrolled bill was signed by the Speaker on Tuesday, December 17, 2019.
The House now doing its normal business, as we said, as they begin to debate the rule that will set the rules for this House debate on impeachment. We'll bring in Mary Bruce. Of course, we all know, Mary, there are two articles of impeachment, both arising out of the president's dealings with Ukraine, one for abuse of power, one for obstruction of Congress. They will be debating them all day long.
Yeah, and George, there is no question, this is a historic day, but this is also a day that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had been hoping to avoid because she knew it would lead to this bitter partisan divide where we now find ourselves today. We are actually waiting for the Speaker. We believe she's going to be walking by down this hall any moment now, making her way into the chamber for this final debate. And she has said that even though this is something that she tried for months essentially to put off, that the president's actions left her no choice. In a letter to her Democratic colleagues yesterday, she said, quote, "If we do not act, we will be derelict in our duty." So today, before the end of the day, we do expect that the House will vote and will pass those two articles of impeachment against the president for abusing his power and obstructing Congress. And of course, we know that it is something that the president is furious about. He has written this scathing 6-page letter to the House Speaker railing against this process, launching many unfounded allegations against Democrats. And we have seen the president's Republican allies here in the House standing firmly behind him, and we can expect that they are likely to launch some procedural motions here, starting the day off with a little bit of partisan fireworks.
And Mary Bruce, we just saw the first one. As you saw, the Republicans got up and moved to adjourn the House. That will bring all the members into the chamber for this first vote.
And here you have it, exactly. We are told that there will be a few of these efforts throughout the day. I think Republicans trying to gum up the works, essentially using every procedural tool they have to try and delay this process, but they are well aware that Democrats are in control here. And even the president himself has admitted in that letter that he's powerless here, essentially to try and prevent this likely outcome here today, George.
He may be powerless to prevent the outcome in the House. John Carl, our chief White House correspondent, but that letter yesterday, unlike any letter we've seen from any president facing impeachment, there haven't been all that many, but this letter, a 6-page real tirade against the process, against the Speaker of the House.
Pure, unadulterated Donald Trump, a stream of consciousness. George, this letter showed anger and defiance. I am told it was written without the input of the White House lawyers, White House counsels. One senior advisor to the president explained to me that he didn't want the lawyers to tell him to tone it down, to tell him no, not to include anything. So White House counsel Pat Cipollone was not brought in until after the letter was drafted. He had some input at the very end, but that was Donald Trump. The words spoken by Donald Trump translated into the letter by his longtime speechwriter Stephen Miller and another top advisor, Eric Ueland. He is defiant, George, but I'm also told that he is very upbeat. He did not want this day to come, but he also is somebody who relishes being in a fight, and in many ways this is a fight he is winning, because although he is almost certain to be impeached today, the White House expects there will not be a single Republican vote in favor of that impeachment, and they expect a similar outcome in the Senate.
They do expect he's going to be acquitted by the Senate. Terry Moran, unadulterated Donald Trump in that letter, and so different from what we have seen before. Of course, Richard Nixon back in 1974, once it became clear he was going to be impeached in the House, he chose to resign. Even Bill Clinton back in 1998, he was impeached almost 21 years ago to this day. But on several occasions, on several days before the vote, he went before the American people. He called members of Congress and apologized.
You know, it was a different America, and looking back at those days, as you say, 20 years ago, 21 years ago, almost to the day, you saw this movement. There was a moment where it looked like Clinton would cut a deal, where Lindsey Graham, now one of the chief defenders of Donald Trump, and at that time one of the chief pursuers of Bill Clinton, was open to a deal. If Bill Clinton admitted guilt, apologized to the country, said contrite things in public, Graham and some of the Republicans said, you know, maybe we can avoid impeachment, censure the president instead. Bill Clinton, looking at a possible criminal prosecution from Ken Starr, decided not to do that, or didn't go far enough for Graham and the Republicans, so impeachment went forward. Today, that's unthinkable. Both sides are dug in, Lindsey Graham most of all. There's going to be nothing but a pitched battle over impeachment, whose outcome is foreordained, as you say.
And our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas, one of the other signs of this defiance we're seeing from the president and his team, his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, continues to work with Ukrainians to try to dig up information on the president's political rivals, even as some of his associates are facing indictment in the Southern District of New York.
George, it's incredible. Giuliani was in the Ukraine just in recent days, continuing to pursue this debunked theory about somehow the Ukrainians having the DNC server, and also trying to dig up dirt on Biden. But as you point out, two of his associates are under indictment, and there's a very active, ongoing investigation in the Southern District of New York, targeting in part this issue of how the former U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine was removed from that slot. Now, you had Giuliani on television in the last couple of days saying he forced her out, and that raises questions about his role in terms of controlling interests at the State Department. So, George, that is the part of the story that even as this impeachment proceeding unfolds, that's a wild card. We don't know what's going to come out of that trial or these upcoming cases, and how that will impact what the Americans think about what's unfolding here in Washington.
Thank you, Pierre. One thing we do know, as Terry said, how this vote is likely to end today. It does appear that Speaker Pelosi has the majority of Democratic votes she needs to pass these articles of impeachment. David Muir here, World News anchor, but we've been paying special attention to those 31 Democrats who live in districts where Donald Trump won back in 2016. One by one over the last few days, they've come out in support of impeachment despite the political peril.
Yeah, one of those representatives, Alyssa Slotkin, she's from a district northwest of Detroit, and she talked at a town hall that we reported on here this week, a very vocal town hall. People very split. In fact, there were signs up there, impeach Slotkin, keep Trump, when she revealed her decision, along with a handful of other moderate Democrats who were, as you said, George, swept in 2 years into the Trump administration. But she said she pored over the evidence from the Democrats and the Republican rebuttal very carefully. She talked about the desk that once belonged to her grandfather. She'd worked for the CIA as an analyst. And she said, bottom line, and she said it again this morning, what this came down to for her is that the U.S. often will say what's expected of a U.S. ally when giving aid in the national interest. And she said, for her, this was not the national interest. This was President Donald Trump's interest in re-election. And she said, listen, if it costs me my job, so be it. And we've heard that from other moderate Democrats as well, George.
Democrats falling in line behind impeachment right now. As John Carl said, Cecilia Vega, Republicans falling in line behind the president. The only former Republican likely to vote for impeachment from Michigan, Justin Amash, of course, left the party over his differences with President Trump several months ago. But the president has unified the Republican Party here, and you can feel not only the president but his campaign hoping to make hay of it.
Exactly. He's not just unifying the party. He is really hoping to unify his base, and the campaign is capitalizing on this. They believe that this impeachment has completely energized their base. They say that they have seen a huge uptick, millions and millions of dollars in fundraising since this impeachment inquiry started. You know, this is a resilient president, right? We have seen a lot of scandals and a lot of controversy since Donald Trump took office, but he is now facing the largest crisis of his presidency. And he is, while playing this sort of sense of the victim in this new letter, he is not going down without a fight. He is defiant, and he is looking past what we're going to see here today into the Senate, where he is hoping and convinced that he will get a complete vindication because of this support, unanimous support nearly, he will see and hopes to see from his party there as well.
Let's bring in a former senator now, former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. And Heidi, just talk at the beginning about the politics of this for Democrats. Right now, the country basically evenly divided, hasn't moved much on impeachment since these hearings began. We've seen the moderate Democrats come out now in support of impeachment. Is this a plus or a minus or a wash?
I think it's a wash. I think that if this were happening 4 months or 3 months before the election, I think it would have a greater impact. You know, a lot of those moderate Democrats did not run as Trump acolytes or run because they were going to support Trump. They ran because they cared about health care. They ran, many of them, because they disagreed with the behavior of the president. It would be unusual for those people who finally got into the political arena to now suggest that they're going to let this behavior take a pass. And so I really applaud a lot of the moderates. I think this is a tough decision. I think it has political risk, but it has more of a historical look back from the perspective of history risk. And the one thing I would warn the Republicans who today are going to take a vote is that you don't know what you don't know. And one of the things about obstruction is that there is a lot of stuff, I think, in the secret file. There's a lot of stuff that history will know that they don't know today, and that's how they're going to be judged. And so this is a historic day, not a political day. We'll see what the political consequences are long term. The mistake the Democrats are making is not treating this as a political process at this point, not getting out and running campaign ads explaining why they're doing what they're doing. I think that they're behind the 8 ball, and they need to catch up.
You know, you mentioned that we don't know what we don't know. In part, that is because the many witnesses who might have valuable information have not come forward. The president is not allowing them to come forward. Also, documents have been withheld. Our recent poll also shows that about 70% of the country believes those witnesses should come forward. Do you see in the Senate, among your former colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, do you see any Republicans breaking ranks with Mitch McConnell to support the Democratic motions for more witnesses?
I think that there's undecided Republicans at this point. Romney, I think, is undecided. I think Lisa is always someone who is going to listen to an argument and do the right thing. I think Susan is probably conflicted and undecided. And so it takes one more beyond that. But I think at this point it's unlikely. I think the judgment of Mitch McConnell will be that it's best to get this over as quickly as possible to lay out the grievance and move forward. And so I think it would take a pretty monumental kind of event between now and January to basically see him subpoena people like John Bolton or Mick Mulvaney.
We can tell you spent a lot of time in the Senate cloakroom. You're on a first-name basis with Lisa Murkowski. Of course, she's the senator from Alaska. Susan Collins,
sorry,
Republican senator from Maine, who just announced earlier this morning that she's going to run for re-election as well. Let's come back to the table here with our legal analysts. And Dan Abrams, let me begin with you, our chief legal analyst. One of the things you heard in the committee debates and in that rules debate earlier, the committee debate yesterday, both sides looking back to the founders to justify their position on impeachment.
Right, and both sides are using language that was used in various debates and isolating particular phrases and saying, see, this proves what the founders actually meant. Because the problem is when you read the words of the Constitution, there's ambiguity. And with that ambiguity comes the need to go back and say, okay, what did they actually mean when they wrote this? And you can highlight one person or another person, and you have both sides trying to make the argument. I think one thing to note here as we talk about the process, big picture here, is that when you were talking to Terry before about looking back in history and the way other presidents have dealt with these kinds of situations, what you have this president doing here is not even trying to fight this impeachment, but trying to undermine the process. He is fundamentally trying to say, this all doesn't matter. Don't listen to any of the specifics of what you're hearing. The entire process is flawed. And I think that that's a very different way of attacking what we're seeing than you've ever seen in previous impeachments.
Yeah, and Kate Shaw, you have seen to limited degrees presidents pull back from cooperation, but also feel compelled to cooperate. Both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton did feel some need to cooperate with the impeachment proceedings.
Well, certainly much more than we've seen President Trump and his operation cooperate with the impeachment proceedings. And I think, Dan, you're right, a lot of process objections coming from the president. But, you look at the letter that he sent yesterday, and he is continuing to double down on this claim that the phone call was perfect. So they're at the heart of the defense, I think, is sort of this two-pronged strategy. The whole thing is illegitimate, but if you do want to talk about the phone call and the dealings with Ukraine, nothing was wrong. I did nothing wrong. The phone call was perfect. And I do think that's actually kind of a helpful argument for the Democrats because it allows them to respond by maintaining that one of the reasons it's so important that they proceed, even though the outcome is likely foreordained, is to send a message and to deter recurrence of this kind of conduct, which, by saying he thinks was fine, there's a message being sent that he would willingly engage in this kind of conduct again.
And Melissa Murray, let's go back to the founders. This was deliberately vague. High crimes and misdemeanors can be in the eye of the beholder. At times, they both wanted Congress to have this power, but they were concerned as well that it be used too often.
They were very concerned that impeachment should only be used in the gravest of circumstances. And it's true, these were broad, textured, open kind of phrases that would be open to interpretation, but they weren't just sort of letting it all hang out. They were very clear that when they said high crimes and misdemeanors and they assumed that treason and bribery would be a subset of those high crimes and misdemeanors, they were thinking specifically of the kind of abuses of trust that could only happen in a position of high authority and power like the presidency. And they were especially concerned about the prospect of an incredibly ambitious president who is charismatic, appealed to the popular masses, and saw himself as above the law.
And let's go back then, and Mary Bruce and John Carl, let me bring you both in on this to begin with. Remind everybody how this all began. Mary Bruce, a whistleblower, went forward giving information on a July 25th phone call the president had with President Zelensky of Ukraine. That was brought forward to the Congress, and everything broke loose.
Yeah, and what was remarkable is that, of course, this came after the Mueller investigation. We saw Speaker Pelosi fending off a lot of pressure from her members to move to impeach then. And it was, of course, this whistleblower complaint that changed everything very quickly. We saw the Speaker change her mind, say that this was a matter that needed further investigation. And just to remember, it has only been 2 months of investigating here, George, and yet we have seen more than 80 hours of hearings. We have heard from more than a dozen witnesses. This has moved incredibly quickly. And that has in part been a challenge for Democrats. They've had to balance here, trying to move quickly to investigate what they say is the president's blatant misconduct, and also the political risk of moving too quickly at the same time. But this has unfolded at a head-spinning pace up here on the Hill.
And John Carl, one of the things we've seen also from the White House is a head-spinning number of defenses of the president over those several weeks.
Absolutely. We've seen the case be made that the president wanted to withhold aid to Ukraine because he didn't think the European countries were giving enough to Ukraine. He didn't think the United States should bear such a burden. We've seen the case made that the president was deeply concerned about corruption in Ukraine and wanted to make sure that the money wasn't going to be squandered. And then in the interaction that I had with acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, he also mentioned that the president wanted Ukraine to investigate that debunked conspiracy theory about the 2016 hacking of the Democratic emails. He admitted a quid pro quo on that point, something that Mulvaney hours later retracted. But you've seen a cascading list of excuses, explanations from the White House. But, George, I think that what's important here is when you look back, this is, as you mentioned at the top of this special report, this is not where Nancy Pelosi wanted to be. She made it very clear as the Mueller investigation was wrapping up that she only wanted to see impeachment go forward if it was going to be overwhelmingly bipartisan. But what happened is, after the Mueller report came out, and the whistleblower complaint made it clear that the president was again in a situation where he was seeking help from a foreign government in what seemed to be targeting his Democratic opponents. Pelosi simply felt that there was no choice, that she had to go forward, even though it did not meet the bar that she had set, did not reach that level of an overwhelmingly bipartisan process. Obviously, it is not that, but she said the argument is, here you have the President of the United States doing exactly what he was accused of going into the Mueller investigation and doing it without apology. And therefore, she felt they needed to go forward with this impeachment process.
And continuing right now, Chairman Nadler described that to me on Sunday as a crime in progress. But let me bring the question you just raised to Heidi Heitkamp. As a Democrat, former Democratic senator, did Nancy Pelosi, did the Speaker of the House, did House Democrats have a choice on this?
I don't think so. I think that the point that I think she had to go was when the moderates wrote the letter to the Washington Post. And these are people who served in the CIA, they served in the military. They said they believed that their oath to the Constitution required that this process go forward. And I think once she had that green light, I think it was really too hard to hold back any other Democratic constituency. And so I think in some ways she got painted in the corner by the moderates, which is ironic, and people who feel strongly, and you see that same sentiment today, George, expressed from all the moderates saying, this isn't about my job, this is about the Constitution, this is about my oath of office.
In our increasingly tribal culture and politics, though, Tara Moran, we've seen both sides fall in line over the course of this debate. There were some Republicans at the beginning of this debate when they first learned of the phone call, when they first learned of the campaign against Ukraine, who expressed some qualms. Those voices have mostly been silenced.
And it's been a remarkable transition to watch, George. You saw at the beginning when that transcript of the president's call with the president of Ukraine came out, and you saw in black and white the president talk about Joe Biden. Do us a favor, though, he says to the president of Ukraine. That gave clearly a lot of voters, because the polls changed right away, and their representatives, including Republicans in Congress, some pause. There were Republicans in public for the first time, really, in this presidency, saying that's not okay, that they were troubled by it, that it's not appropriate. Now you can't find nary a one who will say anything but basically what the president says. That call is perfect. And that shift in the view of the facts, not just how they should be weighed, but reality itself, is essentially that mesmerizing hold that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party. Not only are they defending him from impeachment, they have shifted to his ground that call was perfect.
Yeah, that it was perfect and that there's nothing wrong with it. We'll see if that holds in the Senate. But it does bring us back to another point where the law and the politics intersect. Of course, Dan Abrams, not every impeachable offense is a crime, and not every crime is an impeachable offense. What you saw, though, among Democrats, particularly after coming out of the Judiciary Committee, is trying to say he's both guilty in their view of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, but also laying out crimes they feel he may have committed as well in the course of this.
Right, and that became the strategic choice that they had to make in these articles. Are they going to lay out a specific underlying crime? Bribery was one that had been talked about a lot. And they decided that the more palatable way to go here was to limit it and use abuse of power as kind of a catch-all. To say, here were the problems with what he did. We don't even need to lay out a specific statutory crime. Abuse of power is a constitutional crime, in effect, is what they're arguing. And that was a political decision, right? I mean, if this had been a typical criminal prosecution, a prosecutor would have said, look, we believe we can prove the following elements, and we're going to now move forward on these particular crimes. In this case, because it's political, they decided, well, we think that this is more palatable. This will be something that we can sell more. This will be something where we'll take less heat politically for doing. There's a price to pay for that. The price to pay is now people are arguing, well, there's no underlying crime here. Every other impeachment has had an underlying crime. Where's the underlying crime? So it was a balance and a strategic decision that they had to make. But remember, the comparison to the law is imperfect in this regard. And that's why you have to remember at all times that this is first and foremost a political process.
Political, but we did see, Melissa Marie, the Democrats outline what they see as potential crimes: bribery, potential campaign finance violations, sensitive to this argument that they saw from Republicans in the House Judiciary Committee.
No, that's right. So it isn't the case that there are no crimes here, but they're making the case that they don't have to prove that there are statutory crimes here, and that's a really different thing. When they were talking about bribery before, what they inevitably ran into was this idea that the allegations had to track the statutory requirements for bribery under our modern-day criminal code. That was not what the framers had contemplated. So this abuse of power charge is much broader, would encapsulate the conduct that's been alleged here and the evidence that they have for it. But they're not ruling out the fact that there are underlying crimes here that later he could be prosecuted for.
And the Democrats' case, Shaw, felt that they were on stronger ground because this is where law, politics, and national security all intersected when you dealt with Ukraine. In some way, they've made the argument this is the classic kind of problem that the founders were concerned with.
Right. It's sort of a perfect storm of all of the founders' sort of greatest fears, right? A corrupt and self-dealing president, abuse of power, and the potential jeopardizing of U.S. foreign policy interests, potentially in the context of an improper sort of dealings with a foreign power. So sort of all of that coming together. And I do think that it's right that although the choice was made not to caption the article of impeachment bribery or extortion, the conduct detailed in the kind of paragraphs that underlie the heading of use of power very much tracks the basic elements of bribery or extortion: a corrupt solicitation or exchange, coercion. That's all there, but it's framed in these kind of broader political terms with the law sort of interwoven, but not a specific statutory offense identified or really kind of demarcated.
And let's go back to the politics for a second, David Muir, because one of the things we see when we saw Mary talking about the Speaker's feeling she had no choice, this was being driven, though, from the grassroots as well. A lot of grassroots energy among Democrats. We saw demonstrations across the country last night. In this case, also, the Democratic candidates for president were out in front of the Congress. They were for impeachment before most members of Congress were.
Very much so. Elizabeth Warren was the first, I believe, of the Democratic candidates to come out for impeachment. And we saw Nancy Pelosi and the restraint she had really for quite some time with the Mueller investigation and the evidence that was revealed throughout that investigation, saying there still was not enough there. And as we heard from former Senator Heitkamp there, eventually it was the moderate Democrats, Speaker Pelosi, progressive, but also aware of the moderate part of the Democratic Party, trying to hold back. But when they came forward saying that they now supported impeachment and that the evidence that they thought was very obvious with this Ukraine call, that they had to move forward, she really didn't have anywhere to hide anymore from this notion that they should move forward on impeachment. And to speak to what you talked to John Carl about earlier, which is this sort of evolving defense from the White House over the course of time. One of the central defenses, and we saw it in the last 24 hours, even with the Rules Committee, has been this notion of corruption, and that President Trump wanted to root out corruption in Ukraine for quite some time. And yesterday we heard the Democratic argument reinforce this notion that we never heard about him wanting to get rid of corruption in Ukraine in the first couple of years of his presidency. It wasn't until he was gearing up for this 2020 re-election campaign up against Joe Biden that he's talking about, obviously, the CrowdStrike and about Joe Biden in that phone call, that this was very focused and very much in the Democrats' eyes to help him with his re-election campaign.
When you look at the evidence, Cecilia Vega, the president in that phone call asking for the investigation into Burisma, into the Bidens, but also this debunked theory about CrowdStrike, which goes to the heart of the 2016 campaign, a theory designed to say that it was Ukrainians, not the Russians, who interfered.
And kept peddling that along with his allies, some even on Capitol Hill, despite the common knowledge that that is a conspiracy theory, frankly. But to David's point also, there was some disappointment among Democrats on Capitol Hill when, despite all of this hours of testimony, objectively convincing that this call was not perfect, that the public opinion polls haven't really shifted. That for the most part, we remain a divided nation, and that Americans are really split down the middle on whether the president should be impeached and removed from office, despite this case that they have made. The president, still sticks with this notion that this was a perfect call, and they're really hoping on banking on rallying their base. We're going to see see him head to a rally tonight in Michigan where he's going to try and sell this again. But the reality is we are split down the middle as a country as we are going to see this vote along party lines today inside this chamber.
And can anything move that? But Ted Moran, that is quite a difference again going back to the last impeachment back in 1998. I think coming into impeachment, Donald Trump's approval rating is in the low 40s. The country is split on impeachment. Back in 1998, there was an overwhelming opposition to impeachment in the country. And I think Bill Clinton's approval rating on the day that the impeachment vote took place was at 73%.
And it helped him in his term in office. He got more popular the longer they tried to impeach him. That hasn't happened with Donald Trump, although his numbers have firmed up a little bit from the original breaking of this story. But Americans are locked in over this president, with a couple of exceptions. If you look, you do get big majorities on a couple of issues surrounding this impeachment. One is most Americans, according to our poll, feel that the president did wrong. They don't buy that this was a perfect call. They feel that it was inappropriate for the president. They believe he was trying to pressure Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden, and a majority in our poll and others show that most Americans think that's wrong. Presidents shouldn't do that. The other big majority you get in our poll and others, they are open to hearing more witnesses. This has been a consistent theme throughout the Trump presidency. When the Mueller report was released, you had supermajorities, 70+% of Americans saying, I want to see the full report. This time around, you get about 70% of Americans saying, sure, hear more witnesses. That suggests that the processes aren't broken. We're locked in partisan battle that I think Americans would rather see fought out in the election rather than in the drastic remedy of impeachment.
On that question of witnesses, John Carl, the president has gone back and forth on that, even suggesting now, despite the firm opposition of Mitch McConnell, that he still might be open to it.
And, George, I am told that the president has repeatedly made the point to his team that he wants to reserve the right to call witnesses in the Senate trial. Of course, any witness that would be called by either the House managers, the Democrats, or by the president's side would require a vote of 51 votes in the Senate, a majority vote to call the witness. But I am told that the president does not want to rule this out. So while you see McConnell day after day saying there's absolutely no need for any witnesses, the witnesses were all the witnesses you would have needed or should have been called need to be called by the House, and making the case we're just here to decide based on the evidence that the House brought together. The president himself wants to reserve that right to call witnesses. And by the way, George, his witnesses would be a very different witness list than what Democrats want, what Chuck Schumer wants. He would want to call Hunter Biden, Joe Biden before the Senate. Obviously, there would be a lot of opposition to that. Very hard to see that getting approved.
Unclear if all Republicans would vote for that as well.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Mary Bruce, who's there with Congresswoman Debbie Mercado-Powell from Florida.
Yes, George, we are joined now by the Congresswoman, and I'm wondering if you can just help us set the stage a little bit for this day. We have seen so much testimony in your committee, in the Judiciary Committee, and yet Americans really do remain relatively unswayed according to the polls. A lot of these hearings and testimony doesn't seem to have had much impact. How will today be remembered? What is your message to Americans as they watch these proceedings?
Well, I think that the most important point that I will be making on the House floor is that we took an oath of office to protect the Constitution against all foreign and domestic enemies. I took that oath twice. I became an immigrant of this incredible country when I was 20 years old, and we take that oath very seriously. We didn't come here to impeach the president. We came here to work for the American people, but the president has left us no other choice. And at this moment, it's very important that they understand that it's a crime that he has committed, and it's a crime in progress. There's an urgency in making sure that we do not have foreign interference undermine the integrity of our elections.
And we have seen so many of those moderate Democrats in swing districts lining up one by one to back and support impeachment, but it is not without political risk, these votes here today. Is there any concern the Democrats may be jeopardizing your majority here by taking this step?
And I think that that should show the American public that for us, this is not about politics. that for us, it truly is about protecting our democracy for the future of our children. I'm a mother. I think of my kids. And I also think of so many of us as immigrants who have fled countries where a man has abused his power, surrounded himself or herself with corruption, invited foreign interference, undermining the integrity of our elections. That is why we are doing and taking this vote today. The president has left us with absolutely no other choice. And I truly hope that the Senate conducts a fair trial, because I believe that if Senate Majority Leader is coordinating with a defendant, with someone that has been accused of inviting foreign interference, then we are entering a constitutional crisis.
You saw the president's letter. He calls this an illegal, partisan attempted coup. Your response?
I am from Latin America, and I know what a coup looks like. This is not a coup. This is actually following the Constitution and what the framers intended when they placed that clause of impeachment in. They placed that clause at a moment when the king was undermining the colonies here in the United States. There is a historical perspective here. We had a hearing from constitutional scholars explaining why that clause is in there. And they placed that in there, having the foresight that there could be a man who would take the power of that office, and because he wanted to hold on to that power, would invite foreign interference. That's why we had to take this vote today. And I hope that the American public takes a moment to really look at all the evidence, because the evidence is clear. The facts are uncontested. The Republicans can't actually defend the facts, the evidence, so they try to attack the process. The reality is we have a president who has violated the law, violated the Constitution, and we need to make sure, aside of politics and what's going to happen, we need to make sure that we do not allow this president or any future president to abuse the power of his office.
After today, the ball will... Oh, George, go ahead.
Sorry, no, excuse me, I just wanted to ask the Congresswoman a question. One of the arguments you've seen, though, and actually it's been picked up a little bit by one of your colleagues who's going to vote for one of the articles of impeachment, not the other, Gerald Golden of Maine, is voting against the obstruction of Congress article of impeachment. What about that argument that you all should have waited, gone through the courts, let these privilege claims play out before moving to this impeachment vote?
So I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee, and I can tell you, George, that we have been requesting documents and for witnesses to come and testify in front of the committee, and we have seen time and time again the president actually instruct very fact witnesses, very important witnesses, to not come in front of Congress. We've requested documents. We have not received anything from the president, and there's a matter of urgency. We have 11 months before the 2020 election. The matter of urgency is that we already know that there is foreign interference, and we also know from the president's own words that he is inviting foreign interference for his own private political gain. So we don't have time. It's an urgent threat to our democracy. It's a matter of national security, and that's what I would say to my colleagues.
Congresswoman, thank you for your time today. I know you have a long day ahead there on the House floor. I want to bring that back to the panel here as well. You did see that argument, Dan Abrams, come out at the end of the Judiciary Committee process, this idea the Democrats hit on, that this is a crime in progress. We have to act now to protect the next election.
It's actually the strongest sort of practical argument that the Democrats have when asked the question of why not just let the political process work itself out? Why not wait till 2020 and let the voters decide? And the strongest argument they have is because this president is trying to undermine that process. That's why we can't wait. That's why we have to move forward with impeachment. And as we talk about some of the specifics of the alleged activities, it's important to remember what's happening, I think, with Rudy Giuliani, because he was a central figure in so much of the testimony. You talk about the fact witnesses. It all came back to Rudy Giuliani. It all came back to he was the one who was in charge. He was the one who was directing this. And the question would be, well, what the heck was Rudy Giuliani doing directing this? The fact that you have Giuliani now publicly admitting that he was involved in the ouster of the ambassador to Ukraine really bolsters...
Well, and saying the reason was to get her out of the way of the investigation.
Right. It really bolsters the fundamentals of what the witnesses were saying. So, you know, we get sort of sometimes caught up in the sort of minutia and don't take a step back for a second. But if you take a step back and you think about the focus of those fact witnesses and the response was, well, there's no proof. There's no proof that Giuliani. Gordon Sondland's testimony that effectively Giuliani was in charge There's no proof of that. Oh, he was speculating. Giuliani's now telling us that he was doing this.
John,
I mean, that's incredibly important.
And showing us. And John Carl, I want to bring that back to you because I remember back in May, before we knew about the phone call, of course, before the phone call had taken place with the Ukrainian president, there was an article that broke in the New York Times that said Rudy Giuliani is going to go to Ukraine and look for information that might help the president politically. The outcry was so great that he couldn't take the trip. He was back there last week.
He was back there last week, and then, George, after he returned to the United States, he was at the White House. The president continues to praise Giuliani, calls him maybe the greatest crime fighter of the last 50 years, and suggests that he's doing good work on this. Meanwhile, you talk to virtually everybody else around the president, and they're deeply frustrated with Giuliani. They think Giuliani's creating additional problems for the president, but the president himself clearly continues to regularly talk to Giuliani and seek his counsel, and Giuliani continues to be pushing this with every bit as much energy as he was at the very beginning.
Terry Moran, though, it appears that the president's political strategy, he may not be wrong on this, that if you do it publicly, if you say you did nothing wrong, people will believe it.
You know, and that his instincts have been demonstrated throughout this impeachment process, with Republicans at first beginning to shy away from what they saw on that call. Like most of his aides and most people who heard that call thought it was wrong what the president had said and done, but he drew them back to this line in the sand that he wants to fight on. On the other hand, he continues to investigate the Bidens. He's got Giuliani over there in Ukraine, which does then raise the question, how will the Democrats' this impeachment, stop the president? They say they must do it because it will hold him accountable and therefore stop him. He's still doing it. He's not going to get convicted in the Senate. That might be an argument for taking what is a pretty strong case against executive privilege in the courts and waiting until you can get the testimony of John Bolton or someone else. Because the notion that this is going to stop Donald Trump is ludicrous.
Let me bring in Chris Christie on that, someone who knows Donald Trump well, worked with him for a long time, been friends with him for a long time, and you've always told me that Donald Trump is always going to be Donald Trump. But how concerned should he be, maybe he's directing it, that his lawyer is out there every single day, in Dan Abrams' words, admitting to or implicating himself with new interviews?
Well, listen, I think, George, that this is the type of, aggressive posture that the president wants Rudy Giuliani to take. And I don't believe that Rudy Giuliani would be doing much of what he's doing. I'm not saying every word that comes out of his mouth, but I think the general approach is one that I have to believe is approved by the president. They are very close. And I don't believe that Rudy is off, as we would call it in politics, playing in traffic. I think Rudy is going based upon general direction from his client. And I think the president believes that what he is doing here is attempting to unroot corruption in Ukraine and trying to prove his underlying case, which is that it was appropriate for him to be able to ask for Zelensky and others in the Ukrainian government to try to uncover some of this corruption before they were going to get any significant American aid. I think that's the president's position all along, and I don't think that Giuliani is doing anything now which does anything but support that general position of the president.
And
the president may not approve of every word that comes out of his mouth, but he is approving. I gotta believe he's approving of the general approach.
But on that point, is the president his own best lawyer on this case? I mean, you sort of heard John Carl say that there's some opposition inside the president's team to seeing Rudy Giuliani out there so often in such a public way. Is the president right at making the right calculation here?
Well, listen, I don't think anybody is ever their own best lawyer, George. You know the old saying, if you're your own lawyer, you have a fool for a client. And that's an old legal saying that I know everybody around that table who's got a legal degree knows very well. But the fact is that there's no doubt that there's some difference of opinion inside the White House about Rudy Giuliani's usefulness in all this. But the one person who doesn't have any doubt about it at the moment is the President of the United States. I can tell you he supports Rudy Giuliani wholeheartedly and what Rudy's doing. And whether it's the right strategy or not, George, will be told over time. But it is the president's approach to this, and it is consistent with who the president has always been. If you attack him, he himself and his surrogates attack you twice as hard in an attempt to try to both blunt your attack on him and also to try to deter others from doing the same thing in the future.
You're also a former prosecutor. How worried should Rudy Giuliani be, and by extension the president, now that the Southern District, the district he used to lead as a U.S. attorney, has indicted 2 of his close associates? All reports are they're taking a real hard look at Rudy Giuliani as well.
Well, listen, you never like to be someone who's being examined by any U.S. attorney's office, let alone the Southern District of New York, which has a reputation over time, including when Rudy ran it, for being very, very aggressive office. So you never like that. It's never good to be being examined. The problem is we're all just speculating, George, on what they're really looking at and what may have done. I think Rudy, quite frankly, having known him now for 25 years, I think he deserves the benefit of the doubt given his history regarding criminality. I mean, I have a hard time believing that the Rudy Giuliani I know would be involved in anything that was criminal in nature. That's based upon my relationship with him over all these years. But you never want to be a person who is being examined by a U.S. attorney's office. It's an uncomfortable situation. Even when you've done absolutely nothing wrong, it's an uncomfortable situation. But I also don't believe, in my heart of hearts, and listen, part of this is I'm a friend of Rudy's, and so I can't say that I'm completely objective here, George, but I've known him for 25 years, and I just don't believe that Rudy Giuliani would ever be involved in criminal activity.
Chris Christie, thanks very much. I want to bring that to Pierre Thomas, though. We know that William Barr has a solid hold on this Justice Department. He's shown that he wants to defend the president when he can, as well, on both the Mueller report and also that his recent differences with the Inspector General report as well. Would we expect that he would step into this case in any way, or is the Southern District pretty independent?
Well, the Southern District is very independent, and most attorney generals, which I would point out about this, is that if you look at where the intelligence community has been and where law enforcement has been about this whole issue of the Ukraine, they have basically debunked that idea. You had Tom Bossert, who was the president's former Homeland Security advisor, saying on your show on This Week that he had advised the president that there was nothing to it. And I asked the FBI director point blank last week, is there anything to this notion of basically the Ukrainians somehow having the DNC server? And he said, quote, there was no evidence of it, George.
Well, that gets to something else extraordinary here, Pierre. You're right. The national security apparatus has been in lockstep on this. You also had the candidate for ambassador to Russia and Deputy Secretary of State say that he saw no evidence of interference by Ukraine either. And you had the FBI director at his confirmation hearing say that under no circumstances should anybody in a campaign accept help from a foreign from a foreign entity. Yet in this case, you have the president saying the FBI director is just wrong.
Right. He called basically that notion ridiculous earlier this year. And again, the FBI director, again, finds himself in a very challenging position. He is making it very clear that Russia and Russia alone attacked the U.S. election in a meaningful way in 2016. He says they're up to it as we speak, and they're the biggest threat going forward, which puts him basically at odds with a president who really doesn't talk about that very often, George.
I want to go back to Mary Bruce on Capitol Hill here with one of the president's strongest allies in the House, Mark Meadows.
Yes, well, we are, George. And Congressman Meadows, you are one of the president's fiercest defenders here on the Hill.
And will continue to be, yeah.
And you have called this impeachment process a sham and a hoax. But do you believe with certainty that the president absolutely acted appropriately when he asked Ukraine to investigate his rival?
Yeah, I can tell you, I've been in more hours of deposition than probably any member of Congress, attended every single deposition, additionally have reviewed some of the facts that have not come to light. But I can tell you that that not only has the president acted appropriately, but when you start to look at the evidence that my Democrat colleagues have today and the impeachment effort that they're going forward with, this is a partisan attack. This is nothing more than a political stunt. And to suggest that it has some kind of constitutional nexus, they've quoted more founding fathers in the last 30 days than they have in the last 30 years. And so I can tell you that the American people see it for what it is. Your viewers see it for what it is. And honestly, hopefully the only good thing about today is that maybe we can get on to doing things that matter, like lowering prescription drug prices, fixing roads and bridges.
But process aside, you stand 100% behind the substance of the president's actions.
I stand 110%, but I've seen the evidence. You know, what the interesting thing is, and your viewers maybe they haven't heard this, but when we look at the contributions of other nations, actually the president asked OMB to do a report. Shortly after that, with the intervention of 2 or 3 senators, the aid was released to suggest any connection is connecting dots that Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell would love you to connect, but they just don't connect.
You are very close with the...
Can I follow up on that? I mean, this is George.
Sure,
George. Taking a step back, as a philosophical matter, do you think it's okay for a presidential candidate and a president to invite foreign help in an election? Does that work both ways?
Well, it does work both ways, but here's the other thing is when we look at this, we're looking at corruption more broadly, George. And when you see this, to suggest that anyone running for president should all of a sudden get a ollie oxen free and not be investigated is just not appropriate, George. I mean, when you see this for what it is basically a phone call that took place, then a narrative that was formed around that phone call to suggest that the president did anything improper. We don't even know if Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. I can tell you there's a whole lot of other Democrat colleagues of his that are running against him. I can assure you that they're going to have plenty of fodder. You can't have dozens of phone calls and contacts with President Poroshenko and say that it is totally above board. I mean, what did Hunter Biden actually bring to the case? And in terms of his knowledge and expertise, you know, to my knowledge, he had no international experience that would suggest that he should be on the board of a corrupt company of Burisma.
But as you know, that the investigators in Ukraine looked at that, and Vice President Biden at the time was carrying out U.S. policy that was also backed up by the Europeans, by the World Bank. And there's no evidence that anyone has put forward that his actions were influenced by what his son was doing on the board of that company.
Well, George, with all due respect, there's plenty of evidence that's been put forth. Not a whole lot in the media would like to cover it, just like with the current president, Zelensky, and the 2 deputies of his. All 3 of them have said there was no connection, no pressure, but it seems like everybody wants to avoid that because the key witnesses say that the president didn't do anything inappropriate, and somehow we're supposed to believe Adam Schiff instead of the president of Ukraine. But when we start to look at the details of this, I can tell you, I was part of this Russia investigation. You had people on each and every Sunday, George, that were saying, you know, that the FISA applications were all appropriate. There were a few of us, and myself included, that would said the rest of the story is going to come out, and it did just a few days ago. I can tell you the rest of the story on Ukraine will come out, and we've had sworn testimony, George. When you have actually Nellie Orr giving sworn testimony in a congressional deposition that says not only did a Ukrainian official help her with the her investigation against Donald Trump, I mean, either she's lying to Congress or it's accurate, in which at this point we believe that it's accurate, and there's other facts and information that would support that.
Seems to me you're pretty convinced this is going to be a plus for the president come November.
Well, listen, this is not a plus for the country. Anytime that you go through an impeachment process on this narrow of a debate, you know better than anybody, when you go through an impeachment process, it is not good for the country. It may have good political results. I can tell you there are a number of freshman Democrats who are going to vote for impeachment today, and it will be the only substantial vote they ever take because the ballot box will come back to haunt them in November, and they will go home.
Congressman Meadows, thanks for your time this morning. David, you're picking up on a point you were making earlier. Many of those freshman Democrats who've come forward and said they are now going to vote for impeachment, saying they're doing it knowing full well it could cost them their job in November.
Yeah, they know the reality here, George. And in fact, Ben Siegel, part of our Capitol Hill team, put out a note just a short time ago saying the number's now 27 out of the 31 House Democrats from districts that Trump had won in 2016 have now come forward to say they're going to vote for impeachment today. And many of them echoing each other and saying they know that voters at the ballot box will ultimately have their say about this particular decision today. Now, Democratic strategists have said that they really have no choice here, that if they're in close districts, they need Democrats to come out and vote for them. So if they didn't vote for impeachment, some strategists have said the Republicans are not going to come out and save them at the ballot box in 2020. So their only hope is that they'll have strong support from the Democrats in that district with their decision today. One quick thing, though. You heard Mark Meadows there, and this is not a surprise from Congressman Meadows, supporting that perfect call notion. And Terry Moran said most Republicans have come over to that argument. I thought it was really interesting. In the last 24 hours, Mary Bruce asked the Majority Leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, do you stand behind the content of that call, the transcript of that Ukraine call? She asked him, she had a follow-up as well. He would not go there. He still will not. He said, I'm not an impartial juror here. I am working with the president's lawyers on this Senate trial, but he did not say in front of the cameras yesterday that he supports this as a perfect
And that
call.
does get to a complicated question I want to bring to our legal panel before we go back to Mary Bruce, and that is this oath that the senators are required to take. It's not the oath they take when they're sworn into office. They actually take an oath of impartiality, that they're going to serve with an open mind.
Right. So the Constitution says that when the senators are sitting as jurors in an impeachment trial, they shall be on oath or affirmation separate, as you said, from the regular oath they take when they assume office. The text of that oath isn't in the Constitution, but the Senate rules create the text of the oath, and it is to do impartial justice, right? It has nothing to do with politics or partisanship or policy. It is about the law and the Constitution, and that is the oath they swear. And the Democrats say that should mean they're not sitting as political allies of the president. They are sitting as finders of both law and fact, and that should matter. The Democrats are hoping that's the case.
But it's a difficult balance, Melissa Murray, because we also know that in past impeachments, of course, that president's allies are going to work with him in some fashion. The question is in some way how open you are about it.
Well, I mean, that has been the case. So in the Clinton impeachment, Clinton's chief lawyer was sending signals by tapping his pencil to the Senate to sort of pursue a particular line of questioning or to challenge something. Here, we actually have Mitch McConnell saying it's not going to be these sort of sub rosa techniques, but something even more open. We're actually conferring with the president. Our rules going forward, our line of defense is the same one that's consistent with the president. And that's a completely different animal altogether.
And I think there's a difference in what Mitch McConnell's saying and what Lindsey Graham is saying, right? Lindsey Graham is coming out and effectively saying, I've already decided. I know which way I'm going on this. I don't think that there's any real issue with that. Meaning, he's effectively saying, look, I've watched the fact witnesses. I've heard what they have. Yes, in theory, he's supposed to watch the Senate trial, et cetera. I think that's an honest way to say, this is how I'm moving forward. What Mitch McConnell is saying is something different. What Mitch McConnell, as the majority leader in the Senate, is saying by pronouncing that he's working with the White House on this, that's a different level than saying, I'm just telling you what I've already decided with regard to my vote. And I think that that's a bigger issue than, for example, Lindsey Graham saying I've already made my mind up, which I don't think is that surprising.
John Carl, the president has made a real effort over these last 6 weeks in courting Republican senators, even more than normal.
A real effort and a successful effort. George, almost timed exactly to the start of the impeachment proceedings in the House. The president started to have a series of weekly lunches at the White House where he invited Republican senators. At least 50 Republican senators, including, by the way, his most prominent Republican critic, Mitt Romney, attended at least one of those lunches. Impeachment was a subject of discussion at each of them, I'm told, also other issues. It wasn't just impeachment, but in each one of those, the president made his case that we hear him make publicly, that this whole thing is a sham, that he did nothing wrong. And this effort, and by the way, there's also been a consistent effort to coordinate and to cultivate Republicans in the House, has been deliberate, it has been sustained, and it has been successful. As we talked about earlier, no signs of a single Republican defection on this. That is an extraordinary statement on this process.
Unified Republican Party right now. Back to Mary Bruce on Capitol Hill.
George, we're here with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, and I want to ask you about the Republican perspective here. We've been talking to some of your Republican colleagues. It's clear they think this may actually be a political win for the president. It seems likely that he will be acquitted in the Senate. What do you say to Americans today who are watching this wondering, what's the point?
You know, I asked myself that question too in the summer, in the sense that I was getting an enormous amount of pressure to come out for impeachment. And, you know, including, you know, ads, paid ads were being bought against me, et cetera. And I was worried about how divided our country was. But once that whistleblower made that complaint and Trump appointed Inspector General said it's a credible threat, it's a danger to our national security. If we don't address this now, if we don't send a message that this is not okay behavior, then we're telling future administrations it's okay. So this, for me, is not a political vote in any way, shape, or form. I don't know a member that's putting their finger in the air and saying which way is the wind blowing. We take that oath of office to protect the Constitution, and today's vote for me is protecting our Constitution.
Now, you and the Speaker, in many ways, avoided this vote because you were afraid that we would come to this point, this bitter partisan divide. Have we crossed a line? Will you ever be able to work with this president again?
So I am very methodical with my Republican colleagues, which I have a lot of. I mean, I work very closely with many Republicans, and one of my best friends, if not best friend, in the Congress is a Republican from Michigan. I say we got to pull people together. I say it to cabinet officers. Now, that was before President Trump tweeted at me on Saturday night, and I did an op-ed in the New York Times today, which they asked me to do to explain my thought process. You know, it's going to be very interesting to see the president in Michigan tonight. I'm a little afraid of it. Don't quite know who he's going to attack, but I guess he's going to attack, and I'm guessing there are going to be 3 women that he may. And yet, yep, I hear somebody interrupting.
No, sorry, Congresswoman, because I wanted to pick up on that. We do know the president. This is George Stephanopoulos. We know that the president's going to be in Michigan tonight, and you have pretty keen political antenna. You were one of the few Democrats warning the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2016 that Michigan could go to President Trump. What's happening on the ground there right now in Michigan with the president, and particularly on this issue of impeachment?
It's very torn. I will tell you that, first of all, people are more engaged than I've ever seen them. You know, just this weekend being home, I went to the doctor for an asthma checkup, and 25 people stopped me while I was at the University of Michigan on all sides. The last person I saw said, I shouldn't be bothering you. You're at the doctor. But I have to tell you this, we shouldn't be impeaching. She was nice. I had people yell at me on one side, I had people yell at me, and I think the polling's accurate. I think that Michigan is a very divided state, and there are people on both sides. And I'm going to tell you, I think Donald Trump could win again, depending upon who the Democratic candidate is.
You've heard it there from Debbie Dingell. You were right the last time. We'll see what happens this time around. Congresswoman, thanks very much. I want to go back to the House floor right now because the chairman of the House Rules Committee is now down to begin this debate.
House Calendar number 63, House Resolution 767, resolved that immediately upon adoption of this resolution, without intervention of any point of order, the House shall proceed to the consideration of the House of the resolution, House Resolution 755, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. The amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the resolution, shall be considered as adopted. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the resolution as amended to adoption without intervening motion or demand for division of the question except as follows. A, the resolution as amended shall be debatable for 6 hours, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the
reading the Rules Committee resolution, which is going to be voted on and debated over the next hour, which is setting the rules for the debate that is going to take place over the next day. And Cecilia Vega, we had such a clean preview of what this debate is going to look like in both the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee, and saw just how bitter it had become.
It was a partisan free-for-all. It was, frankly, all-out warfare on both sides, and both sides were fighting to the death. You know, the Iowa caucuses are 40-something days away. All of that, the election, the 2020 election, hanging over all of this, with both sides in this to win it. And while we hear the members of Congress saying that this is not political, that they are in this for the Constitution, the reality is this is a political process. And it is political for the president, and it's political critical for every single member, particularly those that you've been talking about all morning, those freshman Democrats who have to go back and defend this decision in those districts that Trump won.
And Terry Moran, so different. We've been talking about the differences from the Clinton impeachment back in 1998. Of course, Richard Nixon resigned. We've never seen a president get impeached by the House and run for re-election.
It is going to be a major issue in the election, and it is remarkable. The president is essentially announcing in that tirade of a letter to Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, his twin pillars of his re-election campaign. One, a good economy, low unemployment, and for the first time since the Clinton administration, really, wages and family incomes rising faster at the bottom of the economic scale than the top of the economic scale. And second, he's going to go after what he calls the do-nothing Democrats. He's going to ask voters, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about what Democrats have been doing for the past 3 years? And a lot of voters will say, well, going after you in impeachment. And it is clear that that is his, he's not just defending himself, he's advancing his re-election campaign by putting his accusers on trial in the Senate and on the stump.
And John Carl, one of the other things we've seen is the president's focus on those states that he won by a hair back in 2016. Michigan tonight, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania.
He's been focused like a laser on those states, focused on those voters that got him elected president. I would also add to that list Florida as well, George. And tonight, I think that you will see classic Trumpian drama. He is going to his rally in Michigan, Battle Creek, Michigan, and depending on how the timing goes of this House vote today, you may well see a situation where Donald Trump is taking the stage at another Make America Great Again rally at precisely the time that the House of Representatives is voting to impeach him.
And Kate Shaw, this is, again, so different from anything we've seen before. And most presidents in a situation like this will say as little as possible about the actual facts at issue.
Right, and of course, this is not most presidents, and so his strategy has not surprisingly been quite different from what most presidents' strategies would have been, and I think historically have been. I think it's, of course, right, as a political matter, he relishes a fight, and he needs an adversary, and so right now we see Nancy Pelosi, the chairs of the relevant congressional committees. It'll be Chuck Schumer as we shift to a Senate trial as the sort of focus of his ire. I do think, though, that as a political matter, we just don't know how impeachment is going to affect people's ballot box decisions because we've never been in this situation. So it may be helpful to the president to have that being front of mind, but seeing the name of a president who has been impeached, even if, as is likely, has been acquitted in the Senate, might not be helpful.
There's no way we know how that could play out. But we also, and Dan, this is speaking up what Heidi Heitkamp was saying later, the court cases about executive privilege, about the witnesses, are going to continue. The Southern District is going to continue. Not only do we not know how history is going to view this, we don't know what we're going to learn in the next 6 to 9 months.
Right. We're seeing, though, not the key questions working their way through the courts. When I say the key questions, I mean the witnesses like Mulvaney and Bolton, et cetera. So far, the decision has been made, and it appears that that's a pretty definitive decision, that they're not going to fight to force them to testify. You're right that there are other cases that are working their way through the courts that began earlier, began before the Ukraine process even began. I don't know that that's going to be a fundamental game changer. You've heard, though, Democrats dropping the possibility in legal proceedings that there could be another impeachment proceeding down the road, that who knows what's going to happen. We saw this in a 66-page motion filed. I think
we've never seen a president impeached and run for re-election. We've never seen a president impeached twice. Yeah. Let's see if that's coming in the next year. We are going to take a break right now. The House is going to be now debating for the next hour this rule about the debate. We will come back later today when the actual debate on the 2 articles of impeachment, abuse of power, and obstruction of Congress begin. And, of course, our coverage continues right now on ABC News Live with Tom Yanis.
This has been a special report from ABC News.